Hey guys, welcome to book review number 52. I'm having to talk real quiet again because I'm in the library, and you're not supposed to be talking real loud in the library. Well, in any case, the book I am going to be reviewing today, let's leave on it, is Ghetto at the Center of the World. Let's try to get this. Ghetto at the Center of the World, Chungking Mansions, Hong Kong, by Gordon Mathews. So what this is, more than a travelogue, is more an anthropological study. But unlike a lot of anthropological studies that take like a larger form, this focuses on one building within the city of Hong Kong, which is obviously a special administrative region in China. Now, one of the interesting things about Hong Kong is among developed, not really nations, but I mean Hong Kong's sort of a nation, among developed kind of sovereign entities, if you will, Hong Kong is unique in that it really allows anybody to come in on a tourist visa, or mostly on a tourist visa. With most countries, they may have reciprocal agreements with countries they like, but with a lot of countries, particularly with rich countries related to poor countries, you have to obtain a visa, which is often hard to get in order to get into the country. Otherwise, they'll ship you back. So what happens in Hong Kong is, because they're so open, this one particular building developed as kind of a hub, a ghetto, if you will, of the third world peoples. Specifically those related to Africa and South Asia and a little bit of Southeast Asia. South Asia, I mean primarily like India, but also Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan. But far from being an area of no economic activity, it's actually developed, this one building, this Chungking Mansions, has developed as a center for sort of low-end globalization. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean not big international corporations, but small-time traders, small-time businessmen, that even though they are small-time, operate, particularly with the traders, on an international basis, often intercontinental basis when it comes to Africans. Their primary bearers of selling are things like cell phones, electronics, clothes, things that can be produced cheaply on mass scale in China and can be shipped to the third world. But unlike, say, like stuff that's made in China that's shipped to the United States, isn't all handled by the Walmart Corporation or Dell or Apple or somebody like that, Nokia. So what happens is you get often these either knockoffs or imitations, varying levels of quality, and also workmanship and imitation to the real thing, and sometimes just phones that are kind of generic, non-brands in and of themselves. This is particularly related to like cell phones. So Chungking Mansions, although a lot of stuff is done in China, to get into China, at least historically, Africans have a lot of problems. So what's happened is these phones get shipped into Hong Kong and then are kind of traded or bought within Chungking Mansions. And it's actually mentioned, one of the key statistics in the book is that like 1/4 of all cell phones in sub-Saharan Africa are estimated to have gone through the Chungking Mansions at least once in their lifetime. But it's not all just traders. Obviously, that might be a key economic driver to the building. Before I get into the other groups, I think it's good that I start with the traders because they're the kind of drivers of the economics, at least money that isn't like internally within the building that like really is bringing something in. But before I do that, I really should mention why the Chungking Mansions are the way they are. the building was developed, I think, in like the 1960s, late 60s or early 70s. And at the time was considered cutting edge, but very quickly developed problems, primarily related to lack of elevator space. The fact that the towers, there's like the lower level, which is 2 floors that are all interconnected, but then like above that there's 3 different towers, but none of those towers are connected, so there's no really mobility between the two. And this lack of free space or interaction kind of creates a ghettoized atmosphere. Now, not well, it hasn't necessarily become crime-ridden, although there is some crime, but really because it is this economic hub of low-end globalization, really that kind of keeps the crime out, because business is the means of the day and crime is bad for business. And so therefore, not even necessarily the police, who is mentioned in the book, don't really have that strong presence, but the business owners themselves and the private security within Chungking mansions have an incentive not to have mass amounts of crime in the building. And that's not to say that it doesn't exist. There is a problem with drugs that got cleaned up. There's almost, particularly with like heroin addicts, not necessarily with like selling massive amounts of drugs, but more just with like people will go there because it's very cheap to stay there, much as it's cheap for international businessmen to stay there that are from Africa or from some of the poor areas, small-time businessmen. And it's also cheap for drug addicts to stay there. And once again, one of the reasons it's so cheap is because it's kind of ghettoized. The rooms are very, very small. Most of them have limited access to, we're talking like prison cell small, even though they're not prison cells. Most of them have limited access to like outside ventilation, they have these wells, but they're kind of shafts in a complex that is mostly closed off. So what else is there? Well, I guess the other people within the building is heavily covered by Gordon Mathews. Now, I mentioned the traders. The secondary people are people that run businesses within the building themselves. Now, a lot of times these will be people that set up cell phone cells to sell wholesale to the traders that go back to Africa, that go back to South Asia, that go back to Southeast Asia, sell their wares. And those tend to be kind of on the second floor, kind of less obvious to the consumer. But also there are, there's somebody that passed by. Also there's like merchants that just sell more immediately to the more day-to-day needs of the building. There's a lot of South Asian restaurants. Now, even though this is in China, something specifically mentioned within the book was the lack of Chinese restaurants within this building, and that really reflects the demographic of the building itself. Almost no Hong Kong Chinese stay in the building. Now, there are a lot of mainland poor Chinese that come in on business trips and stuff that stay there, but Chungking Mansions really does, up until very recently, has had a very negative connotation within the Hong Kong community, being viewed as kind of below our, hoity-toity, high-end economic development, but still kind of a necessary evil by the people of Hong Kong. And obviously, like the percentage of business that goes through Chungking Mansions compared to the percentage of business as Hong Kong as a whole is minuscule, but most of the business that goes through Hong Kong is what most business is, which is globalized corporations, big business. What really makes Chungking Mansions stand out is its individual proprietorship and kind of globalization at the very sort of bottom rung scale. So there's like I said, the businessmen that own everything from wholesale cell phone stalls to restaurants to small groceries, just anything that would need to serve like day-to-day life of somebody within Chungking Mansions. And it should also be mentioned that people within Chungking Mansions kind of like the internal feel of it, just because a lot of people aren't Chinese, so they feel like even if they're not actively discriminated against, they're kind of seen as outsiders once they go outside Hong Kong or Chungking Mansions into the greater Hong Kong area. So what else? I guess a couple of smaller groups are and these kind of sometimes go hand in hand, are tourists and sex workers or prostitutes. Obviously, the sex workers and prostitutes appeal to the businessmen. A lot of them, because they're small-time businessmen, are in their 20s or 30s, who are away from family. I mean, it's just a perfect scenario set up for, that unfortunate aspect of life. He does mention that because of the nature of their business, the prostitutes within the building, he really didn't get a good feel for them. They were very elusive. I mean, he could find them, knew who they were, but to get kind of a straight answer and create a larger demographic picture from them was very difficult. And I did say a lot of them were from either South Asia, coming from like divorced families, on the bottom rung of society where the women had nothing else to do or no other place to turn, or like Indonesia or someplace which again is impoverished and of limited opportunity for women. And the other group he mentioned that was kind of like a smaller segment but still important were tourists like me. I was actually, the time that I went to Hong Kong, because I was a cheap college student, I stayed there. And it was enjoyable. I mean, I felt it was certainly had its foreign aspect to it, which he mentions that a lot of the backpackers that go there specifically for that. And I have to admit that I was one of them. I liked kind of the exotic nature of not a pampered building where it's just like people wait on you hand and foot, but where there's actual interaction with the rest of society, if you will. But in general, that doesn't make up a huge population. I'd probably say he said that there were maybe like 80 prostitutes in the whole building, or maybe like 100. We're talking a building that can, maybe 80, that can hold, 3,000 or 4,000 people at a time. And then he also mentioned probably the number of tourists that are purely there for, tourist reasons, not as tourist business people or tourist asylum seekers, which I'm about to get into, or maybe like a handful, 100, like 300 or 400 or something, or maybe not even that, maybe like 100 or 200. But besides the business people, the other group that makes up a huge percentage of people are asylum seekers. Now, it's kind of hard to really determine where all these groups, particularly like the business people and the asylum, one ends and the other begins. Because a lot of times people that are asylum seekers are driven out of their country, specifically because of economic reasons. Like the hard conservative definition of asylum seeker is, like somebody from Somalia that had their family killed and was threatened to be killed and escaped and got to Hong Kong and then is on asylum. But there are a lot of people that are kind of in dire straits, but not necessarily fit the nuts and bolts definition of asylum seeker that go to Hong Kong, because even though they are asylum seekers, they don't necessarily have like asylum status, but they can get in with a tourist visa because Hong Kong lets anybody in, more or less. They've kind of closed up a little bit recently, but and then once they're in Hong Kong, get an international aid organization to recognize them as an asylum seeker. Now, maybe not it's still a process. Like if you're an asylum seeker, it means you are obviously seeking asylum, not that you have been granted asylum. So these people are in kind of a constant state of limbo. Something else mentioned in the book is the way that these people that come in on tourist visas that aren't, like pure tourists, that are either there for asylums or there for trade, particularly asylum seekers, will be the working class of the building, if you will. Now, they take this at great risk because the Hong Kong government doesn't allow people who are asylum seekers to work, but one of the ways the Chungking mansions works is sort of its base level of globalization is that they hire people illegally. Now, something that's mentioned by Gordon Mathews in this book is that while there are cases of exploitation and people are generally paid worse than even, say, basic living conditions by the West, in general, it's not to the point where it's truly exploitative, like it is, but these these asylum seekers are also being granted a kind of bare bones living standard by working for some of these either restaurants or cell phone sellers that sell to the international market, or even the tourists that enter the building. So in general, I don't know, that's all the groups. Let's see what else we got in here. It really does not focus too much on Hong Kong. It really is kind of cool in that it internally focuses on the building itself. So the five chapters are places, kind of covered that. Hong Kong, history, goods, I covered that. It kind of mentions how a lot of these traders in the cell phone stalls, it's kind of a high stakes game because people can lose their shirts and really kind of get screwed over. But unlike, say, in a larger corporation where things would be more standardized by just double checking and having the general capacity to make sure everything is at the plant is up to standard, in the shipping process is up to standard, all those things. A lot of times people try to angle one another in these business deals, which is kind of intriguing. But also kind of how, it kind of sucks because people get screwed over, but it's also the way that capitalism develops into a developed society where, people get screwed over, but then they eventually figure it out and make it right. Like techniques of traders, variations of trades, tricks and travels of the phone stalls. He covers this really extensively. I don't want to go into everything because it would be hard, but just the markets in Lagos and Nigeria and Kenya and Mumbai and a lot of the asylum seekers, or not the asylum seekers, but the workers in the building that come on tourist visas come from Bangladesh and the Calcutta region. He also mentions that the building is heavily Islamic, which might be because of its, it's not Islamic in the Saudi Arabian sense, but Islamic in sort of just kind of a vague, what I mean by Saudi Arabian sense is ultra conservative, but just kind of in a vague moral baseline that exists in the building that might, even though people kind of cheat one another, don't prevent complete collapse of the society of the building. He talks about laws. I mentioned the asylum seekers, the police. And he mentions the future. I think what's eventually going to happen in the future is, Hong Kong has been restricting a little bit on the Africans coming in. But I think what it's really going to develop into, and obviously Hong Kongers who are already, mostly wealthy in and of themselves are not going to stay there. I think a lot of the Africans are going to get pushed out by visa regulations, and just the fact that business is going to develop in Africa on a more standard level instead of kind of having all these individual small businessmen go in. I think it's going to be like Chinese corporations go in. But I think what's going to ultimately develop is that Chungking Mansions is going to develop more towards a poor mainland Chinese that come to Hong Kong seeking economic opportunity, as the Hong Kong mainland and or Hong Kong and the mainland, become closer together with the merger of the two. So really, I think you'll see a more Chinese flavor to the Chungking Mansions compared to the African and South Asian flavor you see now. Now, those will always exist, but I think the Chinese flavor will become stronger as not wealthy Chinese, not, the Chinese that are making $1 million, but kind of the rice farmers come in and try to find economic opportunity for themselves in the city of Hong Kong. Well, anyway, you guys, I've kind of rambled on and on. This is a really good book because it's very analytical. It's very really kind of gets to the root of why this building is important. Obviously, Hong Kong is important in and of itself, but why this building within Hong Kong is important, and how it's different, and how it's similar to the way business works in Hong Kong. And yeah, it really gets in there, and you get a picture of who these people are, why it's important, why it matters. One of the most important buildings in the world for the rest of us, not the 1%, but the rest of us that live the day-to-day grinding lives. Maybe not for me personally, but, you know, it's emblematic of the 99%, I guess you would say, if you're a, what do they call those people? Wall Street protesters or whatever. So anyway, one more time. The Ghetto at the Center of the World, Chungking Mansions, Hong Kong, by Gordon Mathews. Alright, see you guys. Enjoy.